Hey, what is up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. We're at the end of a very short series on functions. When I first started learning JavaScript, I was confused because there's a bunch of different ways to write functions, and I wasn't sure exactly when I should choose one over the other. So this short series shows all the different ways you can write a function, and when you might choose to reach for one kind of method versus another, what the advantages or disadvantages of each are in different situations. So far in the first video, we looked at function declarations, which is just a standard function. Then we also looked at function expressions, which are functions that are set as the value of some variable. And then we looked last time at arrow functions, all the different ways you might write arrow functions, and then kind of different use cases for them. This time I want to show you three more. The first of which is called an IIFE. That's an immediately invoked function expression. All right, now, this is going to be an anonymous function, and if we were to just write an anonymous function, we could say something like function, not give it a name, again, it's anonymous here, and we could just have something dumb here like, you have invoked me, all right, something like that. If I save this, I should get an error, and I do because they require some kind of function name. Now, of course, you can come in here and you can add this as a function expression instead and say something like func equals function and save it, and that'll take care of the error. There's a couple other ways that you can work with anonymous functions, but by itself here, it needs a name. But an immediately invoked function expression doesn't. All you do is wrap this in parentheses, which tells JavaScript to run it first. And then you immediately follow it up with another set of parentheses, so that when the page loads, it will automatically invoke. And you see there already, I'm seeing the console log, you have invoked me. So one thing to know is that you can actually have parameters. So let's say I have a name here, and I come in here, and this should have been backticks probably anyhow to start with, but I come in here and I can add the name, and I can then pass it in here as an argument like Chris. And when I refresh, it now says, Chris, you have invoked me. All right, now when would you use something like this? Well, you'd use it in like a closure where you need to create your own scope or something like that. I'm not going to go into all that. You probably won't use this a ton, but just so you know, this is one other way you can write a function. Like an arrow function and like a function expression can be, it is anonymous. The second kind of function I want to show you today is called a callback function. A callback function is just a fancy name that means something is going to happen when something's done. All right, usually this would be like a click or maybe like a timeout or even an event listener like an intersection observer. All right, I won't show you all these today, but basically something's going to happen and then you want the browser to either run a function or you're going to write a function kind of in line there. So let's get an example going. Let's work off a click event. All right, so I'm going to come in here and say const, and I'm going to grab my button 2, which is what I've got in the document over there, and it just has the class of button, and then I'm going to add an event listener. Now, an event listener takes two things. Number one, the kind of event, so here it's click, and then it takes a callback function. Now, I've already got functions up here. Let's say this change button text. Let me grab that, and I'll just add it down this way. And like I mentioned last time, we're not actually running it here, so I'm not going to actually add the parentheses afterwards. That would run it. I'm actually giving it to the browser, and I'm saying, hey, browser, I've got an idea. Can you run this function for me? And then it'll go do it for us. So if I save this here and then I click, it should actually call that function, run it, and then what we have going on here, this style transform scale up and down works perfectly. You can also write the function directly in here, the callback function directly in here. And you can do this a bunch of different ways. You can just write an anonymous function like this. You can name the function. Typically in callback functions, if I'm not sending the browser, saying to the browser, hey, go run this for me, I just write it as an arrow function. So you can come in here and just add your arrow function just like this, because I'm not going to pass anything in, any parameter in. I do need those parentheses like I talked about last time, but I can come in here and say like, you clicked a button, all right? And let's save it. And when I click this, I now have clicked a button. Now you might be wondering why the change button text is still running, and that's because here I have this just on the tag for button, so let me comment that out, save it, and then, oh, this is all applied to this as well. So let me get all that, take it out, and now click, and now it just says you clicked a button. Okay, so you can actually write a callback function in an event listener like this. And when I do that, I typically write arrow functions to keep them nice and brief, and it saves me from typing the word function over and over again. The other use case might be like a timeout. We looked a little bit at this last time, and to make this hopefully not too confusing here, I'm just going to do the timeout directly in here. A timeout takes two things. It takes a function, and it takes a number of milliseconds before something runs. So we'll do like 1,000 milliseconds. And again, you can write this as a traditional function like this, and then just add whatever statement in here. But I typically write these kinds of callback functions, again, as arrow functions. You can also just reference a function. So like we did up above, I could say change button text, and then that would run after well, I guess 1 second, because I have 1,000 milliseconds here. But if I'm writing the callback directly in here, I'll just add it as an arrow function and say like console log, I waited for you. All right, and then when I click this, it'll first fire off, wait a second, and then go ahead and give me this timeout. Intersection observers work the same way. You need to pass in both a callback function, and then you can pass in options as well. And I've done a whole series on intersection observers, and I'll make sure to add a card for that. So today we've looked at IIFEs and we've looked at callback functions. There's one more kind of function I want to show you, and that is what's called a method. Now, a method, kind of like a callback function, isn't really like a new way to write a function. It's more like here's a special use case for a function. And methods is just it's a fancy name for a function that lives on an object. And there's actually a bunch of built-in methods. Before we build something out here, let me come over here and let me get this IIFE out of the way because I'm tired of seeing that. I can come in here and I can just say window. Now, if I hit window, you'll see, and I hit enter, I see all these things that we can do on the window, and any of these that have an F here mean that's actually a function that lives on the window object. So you see it's got arguments, a color, length, all this kind of stuff, prototype. So this is an actual function that lives on the window object. So let me come in here and we can say something like window.alert hi, and then it'll say hi. So this is a function that lives on the window object itself. Well, you can actually do your own objects with functions in them. Methods is what we call those once again. So let's come back to our example and say const, and we can call this like colors or whatever. We're going to declare this variable, and then we're going to set the value to just a series of different functions that live on this object. So these are called methods because they're functions that live on an object. Now there are a few different ways you can write a method, and again, this corresponds to the kind of function kind of syntax we learned up above. The first is you can write just a standard method. In this first one, this kind of standard way, I'll write just a function, the function keyword, and I'm going to pass in some element when I run this. And then I'll say I want the element dot class list dot add, and I'm going to add blue. All right, so this is just kind of a standard method where you use the function keyword. It's anonymous. You'll see there's no name attached to it. You can add a name, but it's scoped to the actual function. But that's the first way. The second way would be using a shorthand method. And here, rather than adding this as like a key value pair, you're simply going to say, let's say like red, and then pass in an element. And we're going to do the same thing. So let me copy this down. Except this time, obviously, instead of adding element and then adding a class of blue, I'm going to add the class of red. There's one other way, and that would be with the arrow syntax. There I'd say something like green. And then again, I'd do a colon because this is an object. And then I'd create a parameter here, pass in the element, and once again, do the same thing. Element, and I'm already here, so let's just do this, dot class list, dot add green. And any of the three of these will work just fine. Now, how do you reference a method? Well, it's just like window.alert. It's the same kind of thing. I come in here and say colors, and then if I hit dot, you see I've got my methods here already showing up for me. So I could say window.blue, and I'm going to pass in some element. Now, because I don't have anything declared, I'll have to go document.query selector, and I'm going to select my div and pass that in. Oh, and I added an extra parentheses inside, or outside rather than inside. And immediately it uses that method, the function that lives on the object, and it runs it for us on whatever we've passed in. Now I come back up here, and this time instead of blue, I could say green, and then hit enter, and again it changes it to green. So methods are functions that live on an object, and I could run red as well and do the same thing. Hopefully this little short series has been helpful. If you like this kind of stuff, go ahead and comment and let me know. I typically have done more like longer project-based tutorials, but I found that this was helpful to kind of break this down into step-by-step processes and walk through the different ways, and then kind of give real-life examples of when you might want to use one over the other. Well, thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe, and happy coding.